Hello lovely people. This week's wrap-up is slightly different from our usual book chat arrangement. This time, slightly belatedly, is the wrap-up of all the books that I set myself to read in my mid-year reading wrap-up in June. So at the start of 2019, I set myself 10 books I wanted to read in the year. In my mid-year wrap-up, I checked in and I wrapped up all the ones that I had read at that point, and then I set myself a couple more to tie me through to the end of the year. This is all of those books that I did manage to read, and like that other video, we're flashing back in time to some past Sophies who are wrapping up immediately upon finishing. So, let's just dive in.
Sophie vlogs.
It is July, the 20th anniversary of the moon landings, and I've just finished The Golden Notebook by Doris Lessing. As I mentioned in the mid-year wrap-up where I set myself a few more books to read, I picked this up because of Elizabeth at BookishNorth, because it's her favourite book. I have found the reading experience interesting. This is about Anna Wolfe, who is a young novelist with writer's block. Essentially, she has these different coloured notebooks. So the black notebook addresses her problem as a writer, red her political life, yellow her relationships and emotions, and the blue becomes a diary of everyday events. But it is a fifth notebook, the golden notebook, which is the key to her recovery and renaissance. This was an interesting reading experience because I know that this is one of those seminal texts which, especially in like feminist literature circles, people recommend, although I gather that Doris Lessing doesn't want you to call it a feminist text, so like, let's discuss that. But essentially, this follows Anna, and it dips into her different notebooks. We come back to the notebooks like a certain number of times. I found this interesting. I liked some bits more than other bits, and I've been thinking about it, and I think that's partly because this narrative style is, I think, deliberately fragmented. Part of what's going on with this, Anna's discussing like her politics, her personal life, like sex, relationships, stuff like this, but a theme in this is sort of like madness and that sort of thing. And I think as this goes on, Anna and her, maybe like, I don't know if it's like her sense of self or like, I don't know, but Anna becomes more fragmented as a person as this goes on, and I think that narrative is reflecting that. And so I think it makes sense when you have this narrative which is split so much into different parts that there are going to be bits which I find more interesting than other bits. Because, you know, like, we're splitting a personality into pieces. That's what Anna's doing with these notebooks. That said, I found some of my favourite bits of this were Anna really grappling and tussling with topics. So, like, ideas of writing and why does she write, why does she not write, crucially? Why does she feel the need to split herself into pieces to write, and what makes good art, what makes good writing, all these sorts of discussions. I found those really interesting. Some of the bits which I struggled with a bit more were the ones to do with Anna's relationships, mostly because I didn't like any of the men in this book, and I also didn't like a lot of the women either, so like, it's fairly even there, and I don't think you're really supposed to, but it made me struggle sometimes when I'm reading Anna's, especially God, Saul at the end. I really don't like Saul. I think he's alright. He's a shit. But essentially though, like, as I'm reading it with the awareness that when this was published, I think it was early 60s this was published, these types of frank discussions about Anna's, like, unmarried, she was married and she had a daughter and then she's divorced and she looks like sort of a single woman, but she has affairs a lot of the time with married men and stuff like this. I can imagine that these frank discussions about relationships, about sex that she's having, I can see at the time of publishing would have been so groundbreaking, and she's verbalizing things which, like, would be controversial to verbalize at that time. And I see that, and I see the worth in that, whilst also acknowledging that as a contemporary reader, I find it harder to get invested in the passages that are about these relationships because I just think every one of the men is a dick. And I'm like, Anna, you could just not have these relationships, just be alone. But, like, so that was a struggle I had with certain passages because I was like, oh, I just don't care about these horrible men. Other things I found interesting, Anna's a communist. I don't really know a lot about communism. This is interesting insofar as there are bits with this which dive quite heavily into communism, the Communist Party's workings, but it's also quite anti-Stalin. Like, there's a lot of criticism about Stalin in this. and I don't know enough about communism to know, like, if at the time this was published that would be controversial or not, but it was certainly an interesting insight into how the party functioned, because that's not something I know anything about, really. Oh, I thought that this was actually written really well as I was reading it, like, especially like when I first started, because I didn't really know what to expect. I've heard of The Golden Notebook, and books like The House at the End of Hope Street, which by Menna van Praag, talked quite a lot about The Golden Notebook, which is why I wanted to read it initially, because of that book. So it's interesting. I didn't know what to expect, and so I spent like the first like 100 to 200 pages as I was reading. I was just like, you know what, this is really well written, like, just objectively, irregardless of what is actually taking place plot-wise. It's just really well written. So I'm really glad I read this, because it was an interesting read. It's interesting to look at it, how it fits within like literary canon and of its time and blah blah blah. It wasn't always, certain passages resonated with me a lot more than certain other passages, but again, that is, I think, inevitable when you have a fragmentary book like this. But on the whole, glad I read it. Thank you, Elizabeth, for the recommendation. It's still the 20th of July. I haven't recorded for a little while, so I've got a little bit of a backlog on this. So, I'm going to talk about next, I'm going to talk about, if I can get them in the right order, Katharine Kerr, the Westland cycle. I mentioned in my mid-year wrap-up that the Devery cycle by Katharine Kerr is a big 16-book series that is split into 4 sets of 4 books. Each set explores like a different like moment. One of the really interesting things about this series is it's fantasy that is based heavily in Celtic history, Celtic mythology, stuff like that. And there are these ideas of recurring lives. So in the first set of these, we had our main characters are Jill, Rhodri, and Nevin, and we are getting like a contemporary line, but then also you're seeing some of their past lives. And as you learn more about the past lives, you see the repercussions of those lives are how they affect the contemporary plotline that you're focused on. This series continues to focus on those people. It's going to be inevitable that there's going to be some slight spoilers for the first set of books, because I can't talk about the start point of this without spoiling that. If this is something that you don't want to know anything about, I will leave timestamps in the description next to each book to tell you when I talk about them, so you can skip ahead if you want to skip this bit. Essentially, this follows Jill and Rhodri again, and it's looking at our main plot lines. We've got these things called guardians. Guardians are sort of like they missed out on that bit where they could have got bodies and entered into the cycle of life, and so instead they're these quite powerful but like ethereal beings. You get a lot of, one of the real pluses of this Westland cycle, I think, is that you get a lot of insight, especially in the first book, A Time of Exile, which into the elves and elvish culture and that sort of thing, this relationship with guardians and stuff like that. That was really interesting. I really liked that. I think the elves are, Katharine Kerr manages to incorporate a lot of things that you would expect from like fantasy elves, but also there's like quite a lot of originality here. With stuff like dwarves come into this later in the game, I felt like the dwarves were a little bit more like stereotypically dwarven, but that's not a criticism, that's just like, I felt like the elves had a little bit more to like differentiate themselves from other fantasy series. One thing I really liked about this is dragons start to get brought in. I've mentioned before that when I was a kid I accidentally read this series out of order, which you kind of can do, but it doesn't make the most sense. And I read part of a later series in which there are lots of dragons, so I've been waiting for the dragons to come in. I didn't love the dragon portrayal 100%. Let me talk. So, essentially, my critique comes down to this. Number one, I really enjoyed Jill as a Daema. I don't know if it's Dwemer or Daema. My Welsh knowledge wants me to say Daema, but I don't know if that's right. I really enjoyed Jill as like immensely powerful, mature woman. But then in a later book, Time of Justice, I think, you also get to flash back to young Jill, and it was interesting to have that because it does show you how much she as a character has changed. And in this set of 4, there are a lot more women, period, and there are a lot more interesting women. So like Jill, Dalla, Cara, I really enjoyed their presence. To link onto Rhodri, I can't roll my R's, I'm sorry, but to link onto Rhodri's plotline, got a bit fed up with him. if I could never hear about his berserker laugh ever again, I would be quite happy with that. And also, it sort of feels like because Jill left that relationship and went to do JMR, it's like we don't know what to do with Rodri, and so instead, he's just, every single book has a different woman who he's, like, all into, and I'm just a bit bored of, like, Rodri, oh, my lady death, I'm really excited to die one day in battle, ooh, sexy lady, and, like, this dwarf lady he falls in love with at some point, and then it's just like, oh, she's the love of my life, and I'm like, you barely better, mate. And then the relationship between Rodri and the dragon also kind of fell into that a little bit for me, because the dragon is female. There was, like, a moment in it when, like, the dragon, like, killed a cow and is eating a cow or something, and Rodri was, like, looking at her, and he's like, you can tell she's a sophisticated lady dragon by the way that she is delicately consuming the cow. And I was just like, she's a dragon, she's eating a cow. Just, I don't. So, like, got a bit fed up with Rodri. I did enjoy Jill's plotlines. I think another stumbling block I had is that the Guardian plotline wasn't always the most interesting to me. So, and also, like, there was a lot of... It felt like the past lives had much more of a relevance in the first 4 cycle. In this one, there were some times where we flashed to past lives, and I didn't really see the point. For example, like, in the last book, this is, like, obviously spoilers, I'm talking about the series as a whole, but in the last book, a lot of the contemporary plotline is a siege, which involves a lot of waiting around, and then the past plotline is explaining the presence of someone on the enemy side. So the entire time the past plotline was happening, I was aware of its inevitable outcome, because it has to end a certain way for this figure to be present at this contemporary plotline event, which had less relevance to me, I felt. Whereas in the first series, I felt like there was just more, I was more interested in these past flashbacks, because it explained so much about how all of these people's how all these people's lives have become tangled to this extent and the debts they owe each other. Whereas that was much more present in, like, these figures of, like, Kara and Iraine and stuff. I was more interested in it in relation to them rather than in relation to our main people. So yeah, I did enjoy this. I think I gave all of these a 3 out of 5 stars. And also, I started reading this in June. It's now July. I've read all 4 books. I obviously liked it enough to read all 4 books in quite quick succession. I do think there are a lot of really great things about this series. I found this second portion a little bit less inspired and a little bit more like, I'm enjoying it, but it's not dazzling me. I'd be interesting to see how the next 4 goes. I'm going to give it a little bit of a break before I dive into them, but I will be diving into them at some point while I can still remember all of this. So I'm interested. We'll see how that goes. After that is a book, I think I finished this early June. That's The Faerie Queene by Edmund Spenser. I'm bringing it up in this one because actually this was one of the books I set myself to read in 2018, and I started reading this in May 2018 and I finished reading it in June 2019. Partly that's because I kept putting it down and forgetting I was reading it, and then, like, I would remember and be like, oh wait, I should really finish The Faerie Queene. It's also partly because this is an epic poem in Elizabethan verse that I decided I was going to read it all out loud to myself before I went to bed every night, so it's been a time. It's taken me a while. I feel an immense sense of satisfaction from having finished it. Certain, as with a lot of epic poems, this is split into books. Certain books of this were more interesting to me than others. My favourite part of this is, this is all like, we're in the land of Faerie, like there's various knights, they have their ladies, they're doing quests, that sort of thing. I really liked Britomart, because Britomart is a lady knight who is just sort of like, a lot of her plotline was just, oh, here's this lady in distress, and Britomart, like, rides in, beats everyone in battle, saves the lady, helps try and reunite the lady with her love, whilst also searching for her own love, and I just thought Britomart was really great, and quite frankly, I could have watched a whole film about Britomart running around saving ladies in trouble. It was great. A lot of this, after a while, you get a little bit used to, like, what's going to be happening, but there are some really cool ideas in here. I think some, because this wasn't actually finished, Edmund Spenser never actually properly finished it, so certain books sort of towards the end, I wondered how it would be if he'd have fully finished them. But essentially, it's very Elizabethan in its gender roles, it's very Elizabethan in how, like, what are good attributes, what are bad attributes, stuff like that. But I'm really glad I read it. It's a big one. Take it off my list of achievements. I'm sure it's going to come up in conversation, and I'm going to think about it a lot and stuff like that going forward. So, happy with that achievement. It is August, and I have just read Like Water for Chocolate by Laura Esquival, a novel in monthly instalments with recipes, romances, and home remedies. This is a really classic piece of magical fiction, which is why I wanted to read it. I will say, there were things I liked about this. On the whole, I didn't love this, and I'm a bit disappointed by it. And I think I've isolated that what I didn't really like is I wasn't really rooting for the love story that is at the heart of this story. The back describes this as a sumptuous feast of a novel. It relates the bizarre history of the all-female De La Garza family. Tita, the youngest daughter of the house, has been forbidden to marry, condemned by Mexican tradition to look after her mother until she dies. But Tita falls in love with Pedro, and in desperation he marries her sister Rosora so that he can stay close to her. For the next 22 years, Tita and Pedro are forced to circle each other in unconsummated passion. Don't know why I struggled with that so much. Only a freakish chain of tragedies, bad luck, and fate to finally reunite them against all the odds. Here's the thing. I don't like Pedro. I don't think Pedro is shit. So I struggled to emotionally connect to this book a lot, because this at the heart, the passion between the two characters, I just couldn't root for, because I just think Pedro made really stupid decisions, and he just annoyed me as a character. The thing I loved about this is I loved how magical realism was manifested through food. I love food writing. It's one of the reasons why I was interested in this in the first place. And Tita, her role as the one who has to stay unmarried and look after her family, means that she has been brought up all around food and doing all this cooking. And so when she has these strong emotions, they manifest themselves into the dishes she's making. And then if you consume that dish, you're consuming that emotion, and it affects the people. And that side of things, I loved that. I thought that was brilliant. The way in which that led to certain plot events and stuff was interesting. I thought it was, I really enjoyed how that was interweaved, and also, it says here, a novel in monthly instalments with recipes, romances, and home remedies. Each month, because it goes through months like January, February, each month, so like at the end of each sort of chapter that is the month, so you finish February, and then it's to be continued, next month's recipe, quail and rose petal sauce. And then when you start March, you get the ingredients list, and then it's called preparation, so it's like each chapter, you're getting another chapter of these people's lives, but you're also getting the dish, and how do you make the dish, and sometimes like what is some history of the dish, and that sort of thing. And all of these aspects to do with food, I thought that was brilliant. The actual love story at the heart of this, I just wasn't rooting for them to be together. On the whole, I am glad I read it, because it is an iconic piece of magical realism, so I am glad to have read it and formulated my own opinion on it. Maybe if I reread it and I went in again knowing that I'm not rooting for the romance, I would maybe like it a bit more, maybe, because I would be able to appreciate it for what it is, rather than sometimes I think if I read something and then it jars me slightly, it takes me a little while to like settle back down, and because it's quite short, I couldn't really settle back in, because all the time that Pedro kept popping, I was like, you're an idiot, Pedro. So like, those are the conflicting feelings I had on it. On the whole, glad I read it. Maybe if I gave it some time and revisited it, I might like it a bit more. It's December the 31st, and I've just remembered that I need to finish off this video. In October, I read The Woman in White by Wilkie Collins. I'm going to leave a link to the wrap-up down below, because I feel like I talked about it quite thoroughly there, so if you are interested in that one, please go there. I did not read the Jane Austen book I set myself. I did read a different Jane Austen, but that will be coming in a book chat soon. So the final book I have to wrap up for the 10 books that I set myself to read this year is The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss. I meant to read it in autumn. I actually read it in December, but I did read it. I thoroughly enjoyed this. I gave this a 4 out of 5 stars, and I think partly I might have... You know when you're like, okay, this is one of the highest rated books on my TBR, I'm going in with very high expectations. I had a fun time. At the edges, I was like, why does everyone love it to the extent they do? But I don't want that to be a critique. That's not a critique. I'm more saying that sometimes I psych myself out with books. So, this tells the story of Kvothe. I don't know how to say his name. I'm sorry. I'm going to try and just be consistent. And essentially, he is telling his tale to this chronicler. I find that as a setup interesting. So you have these mixed narratives of like, you have like a third person narration when we're like in the world where Kvothe and the chronicler are like interacting, and then we have first person narration when Kvothe is telling you his story. And I find that interesting. Like, I don't know, there's an element of me being mildly mistrustful of our narration from Kvothe, because like it reminds me a little bit of Gene Wolfe and Book of the New Sun, and Severian is like a very unreliable narrator insofar as like he tells you things in a certain way, and then later you have realizations that what he's described to you is different to how you picture it medieval, but actually like, oh, you know, it's actually like an old space rocket or something. Equally, it also reminded me a bit of like Odysseus in the Odyssey, because I read the Odyssey recently, where like when someone takes over, so like you could imagine your third person narration style, you're getting the 100% truth because it's like an objective figure, but when someone is telling you something, like they have an agency, they have a story to tell, I don't know, there's like an interesting narrative thing going on there, but I don't know if that's deliberate or I'm just inherently mistrustful. But Kvothe is telling us about how, essentially his life. Things I liked about this. This is a chunky book, and it's that weird thing where I'm kind of like, technically lots happened because we covered a large portion of time, but also I feel like not a huge amount happened, kind of. What I'm saying is, I enjoyed taking time to settle into this world. The magic system in this is interesting, and I like that you're kind of given, especially during his time studying under Ben and then at university and stuff like this, you get a better understanding of how this magic works and like sympathy and all stuff like that. So that side I really enjoyed. At times I did feel like it was a bit slower than I would have liked, but that wasn't a consistent feeling throughout the whole book. On the whole, I did feel very immersed, and I think that's good. One thing that is something that stopped me from giving it a 5-star rating is Kvothe as a main character is just like inherently good at everything. Like, he's like the youngest child to get into the university. Everything he tries, he's amazing at. Every woman he meets wants to sleep with him, etc. And this is convenient plot-wise. And then sometimes I became frustrated by it. So I didn't dislike him as a character necessarily. It's just sometimes it's hard to feel rooted in a character's struggles when it feels like they're just going to discover that they can inherently do something and they'll be fine. I think one of the things that stopped me giving it like a 5-star rating was that sometimes I didn't feel invested in that struggle because it wasn't always a struggle. There were moments, and I will say, like, there were moments that he makes mistakes and stuff like that, and I actually liked those moments because I was like, yes, I need my character to grow. I need him to not just be like, now I can do X thing, but like, have you grown as a person? That's something which I like in my main character. So occasionally I just wanted a little bit less of him being super duper competent and amazing at everything. Something I did really like about this is how music runs throughout it. I thought he plays the lute, and just like the way that music is talked about, I really loved that. And the songs and like the stories that are associated with the songs and that sort of thing, because there's an inherent thing at a core where he's trying to find out more about these beings that are like seem mythical, but it's like, is there truth there? And I enjoy this, trying to piece together what the actual true story is and stuff like this, and find out the truth in all of the tales and stuff like that. My favourite thing I think about this is I love this idea that because you see where he ends up, because he is telling the tale to chronicler, but he's just like an innkeep, and like he's got all these tales about him being this amazing hero and stuff, but obviously something has to happen because he's not that when we meet him. So it's interesting knowing where we're going to end up. We're going to end up at a point where he's like walked away from this identity and this destiny and stuff, and seems to be suffering as a result of it. And I think that that's so interesting as a concept with a hero. So I'm definitely intrigued to see how that's going to continue on through the book and how we are going to end up here, because presumably, like, these are called like the King Killer Chronicles. Presumably he's going to have to like kill a king and stuff. I don't know. But we've got 2 books, so the second book is out and I own it. The third book has not been released yet. I would like to read them both currently. So yes, essentially, I could probably babble for longer, but I'm essentially intrigued. I am in. This is my first Patrick Rothfuss. I definitely will be reading the second book. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. It is not my absolute favourite fantasy, but I have enjoyed getting to know this world, and also I think it might be a book that might benefit on a reread once I've read the second book, or even once I have read the whole trilogy, to then do a reread when the final book is out, because sometimes you read things and you get a sense that things are going to have more weight to them if you were to reread them. I don't know, but suffice to say, it was a really great book. I'm really glad I actually read it this year, and I had a cracking time. So, as I already said in my 2020 goals list, I'm not going to be setting myself 10 books next year because I don't really know if this format works well of doing like these random little roundups. But it has been fun. I'm glad I read these books that I set myself to read. As per usual, I would love to hear your thoughts on any of them if you have thoughts. But otherwise, I will see you next time for something different.